if you follow those mandates, you got to have a massive, massive amount of battery production. And by all indication, the vast majority of that Congo production is controlled by China. A huge amount of that has child labor and other issues that we've talked about. And you got trafficked child slaves that are reported in the production of it. Why on earth would we want to limit the ability of Americans to go mine cobalt? Now, I might say, well, that's kind of great because I actually still want the internal combustion engine. I actually think it's affordable and better for the American worker who wants the plumber in San Marcos, Texas, to be able to go to work and afford the car. But if you buy into the motion of having, EVs that you can drive all over creation, even if you're from Texas and you had to do like I did, I appreciate the chairman pointing out the passing of my grandma. I had to drive 6 hours, like 300 miles to go see my grandma Thursday before she passed away, and 6 hours back. I couldn't do that at an EV. I wouldn't have been able to make the round trip in time. But okay, assume we were able to ever produce the batteries that last long enough, the charging stations, all the stuff. Why would we get rid of the American production of it?
Thank you. There are several different components to your question. I want to make sure that I address them. First and foremost, on the issue of child exploitation, child labor, I think it is the role of the United States for us to push back forcefully on this production, and not just in the production of energy, but across the board. We see this in textile production, energy production, cobalt mining. It is horrific, and we need to make sure that our sources do not include child labor. But to get to the core of the question, too, on the China front, is that I find it interesting that there is this concern about Chinese ownership of minerals, and it is legitimate. However, the response to that seems to be deregulation specifically for companies that are largely Chinese-owned here in the United States. These companies are subsidiaries where the benefit of what we are deregulating here, and I'll give you a specific example. I would be remiss not to mention that the minerals produced specifically at the proposed Twin Metals mine that is implicated in this legislation would most likely be shipped to China for refining and smelting to be sold on the global market. These are not American-owned companies that American mined minerals would be going to. And so if your concern is the Chinese predominance of ownership in the mining market, I would be very concerned about passing this legislation. So that, I think, on the China piece there. And lastly, on the meeting our targets and mining cobalt, I think it's a false choice to say that in order for us to mine cobalt, we either have to destroy some of the most sacred lands in the United States or rely on child labor. There's responsible mining in the United States that is available to us. But secondly, I also find it interesting that the majority presently pushes back against battery recycling, which would allow us to open the path to reducing our reliance on mining in general. There is enormous potential in recycling many of these EV batteries, but we have not made the investments or the shifts necessary in order to unlock that so that we can reduce our reliance on solely mining as the only source of battery. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. Before I give my colleague a chance to respond, as I think he probably wishes to, I would only note that happy to have a conversation about restricting Chinese ownership of any number of corporate activities in the United States, or ownership of farmland, or ownership of land near military bases, or frankly, ownership of meat packing, production, including mineral production and so forth. A significant reason why it would be mined here and shipped back is because they've got all the production facilities, because they've been building and mining these, because they've got the resources to do that. And here we've got the God-given benefit in America being able to produce very clean burning natural gas, very efficient ability to have automobiles that have an internal combustion engine, which are basically fractionally about 1.5% of the CO2 production when you compare it to what we're producing in China, as the gentleman noted, where they've got 1,100 coal-fired plants burning in China, and we have 250, and they're building 2 a week, and we're building none. And yet we're building no nuclear plants except for the Georgia plant that was finally put online 45 years after it was permitted by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So I think if we're going to be serious about it, we can't say, I just don't accept the premise that the sort of general notion of, well, we got to push back on the child labor. Well, I mean, we're going to use that child labor unless we find a supply right now. because the Biden administration has put their foot on the gas to say we must have EVs in 2030 at the extent of 2/3 of our entire production line. So Toyota is not a Chinese-owned company, but Toyota has a massive production facility in San Antonio, tells me that they will largely have to put their entire assembly line starting next year into EVs pretty much only because they can't financially afford to do otherwise with these mandates on the tailpipe rule, which will be shutting down the internal combustion engine production of the Toyota vehicles. No Chinese ownership there because that's where they are, which will then mandate the EVs, driving up the price of those vehicles. And then they got to go figure out how to get the batteries and get the production.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. Ms. Scanlon?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am very concerned that these bills are a huge step back for our environment and our endangered species. They seem to be predicated on a false kind of a binary choice. And I don't think it's true that President Biden or Democrats or the American people have any interest in having a blanket prohibition on development, but we do want a system that fairly takes into account public safety, conservation, and the damage to our environment and our children's future if we aren't taking those into consideration. So can you comment on that?
Absolutely, Representative Scanlon. As you noted, particularly in the public land rule, specifically, this shift in the rule is not even to put conservation and restoration above, energy production, recreation, or any other considerations. It's simply to allow the consideration to be on equal footing. And I would emphatically push back on the notion that conservation is just simply cordoning off, that this rule is just about conservation and cordoning off several acres of land and saying there's nothing to be done here. But this is also about land restoration. And there are so many acres of land, federal lands, public lands. This is land that belongs to the people of the United States of America, that has been dumped on, that has been allowed to be overridden with toxic waste, that people are getting sick from, that species are becoming endangered from. And to allow that to simply be in equal consideration as the federal government and the Bureau of Land Management doles out and makes decisions, oftentimes affirmatively about energy production, I think is eminently reasonable.
I think that makes a lot of sense, that we're trying to balance some competing concerns, but that we really do need to take into account these conservation concerns. So I would yield back.